welcome to this week's webcast, and thank you for coming. I believe we have one next week as well, so and thereafter. So before we get started, I wanted to remind people that this Friday at 5 o'clock we're going to do the first Friday happy hour on the second Friday this month. So 5 o'clock over at Bridger Brewing, 5 to 7 we'll get together for a happy hour, and hope you can all make it. Today we're happy to have Jason Pearcy from the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics here at MSU. Jason comes to us, before he came here, he was at Tulane for a while. He did his graduate work at University of Colorado, and his work is in the area of industrial organization. I'm not sure how much Jason's going to talk about that, but I just thought I'd kind of explain. Many of you have taken an Econ 101 class where you saw a supply curve and a demand curve and the price and a quantity, and said that's how markets work. That's how markets work in very simple models, but what industrial organization looks at is how do markets really work in more complex real-world situations. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason, and thank you very much.
Well, thanks for coming, and thanks for having me as well. So the paper I'm going to talk about is joint with Mark Haggerty and Megan Lawson over at Headwaters Economics. And I guess it's always bad when you need to explain the title from the get-go. But so steam coal is an arm's length. So steam coal is coal used for power generation. So they burn it to make steam and then turn the turbines and make electricity. And then arm's length. So we think about transactions. There's arm's length transactions and non-arm's length transactions. And so I guess a weird example would be if you want to sell your car to your brother, but you want to avoid tax payments. And so if your car is worth, $1,000, you could write a bill of sale where you're going to sell it to your brother for $1, and then you avoid all tax payments. Well, the problem with that transaction is that it's not at arm's length. There's not sufficient separation between the two transacting parties. And so then you're worried about any issues they may have about efficient prices and things like that. And so what you want to think about would be non-arm's length transactions where the parties are going to be, I'm getting this completely wrong. Yes. So you want to think about arm's length transactions where the parties are sufficiently farther away and unrelated. And so we're going to think about both, so we're worried about affiliated sales and arm's length and non-arm's length transactions in these coal markets, and to think about how these transactions might be addressed by some proposed reform options and kind of what kind of impact that's going to have. So that's the talk I'm going to give you today. And then, so, this presentation is really just a bad cut and paste job from the academic paper that I have. So if you want to know more information about where the figures come from, tables, all the nice equations in the model, that's all going to be on the paper on my website. So the paper is currently under review. Any comments you have though would be great, because my experience will be like another 4 years before it's published. So, if you have any comments, you have plenty of time to incorporate them, and I'll also talk about some future work that I'm thinking about doing as well. So the other thing just to say from the get-go is that I did receive financial support from Headwater Economics for this project. So they bought a really expensive data set for me to use, which is, as in the comments, is really fun to play with. But it's been great working with them because I get to work on academic econ stuff, and then they think about policy relevance of what I do and then promote that out there. And I get to be detached from that but see my work have a larger impact. So it's been fun. I guess why I'm acknowledging stuff, my father-in-law was a longtime employee of Arch Coal, so that can bias my results as well. But the Arch Coal stock is kind of in the tank, so nobody cares about that. All right. So just a little bit of talk, because I'm assuming that at least I didn't know a lot about coal and natural resource revenues before I got started on this project. So I'm not going to make any assumptions about what you guys may or may not know. But so in this talk, I want to think about natural resource payments associated with coal extraction. And so if I think about different types of payments that you pay for natural resource extraction, so the first thing you have to pay, whether you mine coal or drill for oil or gas, is you have to make royalty payments. And so royalty payments are going to be the landowner's share of revenue that they receive. And these are negotiated in the contracts. But so if I think about particularly coal, because that's what we want to focus on, so coal could be mined on federal land, could be mined on state land or private land. And so for this talk, I want to think about coal being mined on federal land and then royalty payments being made to the federal government. So states have their own royalty rates, their private contracts with their own royalty rates as well. So then after you mine coal and pay your royalty revenue that the landowner is entitled to, states have separate taxes. So all states have separate taxes. There's a lot of variety of policies that states implement for severance taxes. But severance taxes, you got to pay the state. That's after you deduct royalty payments. And then if I think about coal mining companies, you know, they have to pay corporate income taxes, whatever those rates are. They vary by state as well. And then there are these bonus payments. So a lot of times when leases get negotiated on federal land, they try to do it through a competitive auctioning process. And part of that process, these companies agree to make bonus payments associated with those leases as well. So, you know, kind of you think about these 4 different types of payments for resource revenues, and I'm just going to focus on the first one, so thinking about royalty revenues for coal extracted on federal land. And then a little fun fact about resource revenues is that they are the largest non-tax source of revenue for the U.S. government. These are kind of a big deal. So we've got, for coal extracted on federal land, we've got the Federal Coal Leasing Program. So this is administered by the Bureau of Land Management and the Honor, so the Office of Natural Resource Revenue. So they kind of figure out what's going on with this. But so if you look at what Honor has to do, they have a bunch of different objectives, and sometimes those objectives conflict with one another. So they need to make sure they're getting a fair return on our resources. They also maybe want to keep energy prices low. Or maybe they want to promote jobs and have good coal mining jobs. Maybe a bunch of different diverse objectives that they want to achieve. So some fun facts about federal coal leasing is that the federal government owns 1/3 of the coal reserves of the United States. So states own reserves as well. I don't know how much, but the federal government itself owns 1/3 of the reserves. 43% of domestic production right now for coal occurs on federal land. And in 2014, we received $704 million in royalty payments, just in federal leases. So that doesn't include royalty payments for state leases or private leases. It doesn't include severance tax payments or bonus payments or anything else like that. All right, so talk about the reform. So currently, royalty payments are going to be based on the first sale. And so what we're worried about is a coal mine extracting coal, selling it to an affiliate marketing coal company that they own, and then reselling that coal from their affiliate marketing group to the end user. Where the end user is going to be coal-fired power plant, some utility, maybe an export market, or whatever you want to think about. So you might imagine, you know, the thing that you want to worry about is that first sale to the affiliated party is going to be a non-arm's length transaction. I got it right that time. All right. But then the sale from the marketing group to the end user is going to be an arm's length transaction. And so if you want to, you're worried about using their relationship to artificially lower the price that's used for royalty valuations. And then you're missing out on a large share of the royalty revenues that you have. All right? So a lot of times that first sale is going to be between affiliated parties. This is going to be a non-arm's length transaction. And so what the BLM and Honor do now is they have these benchmark rules that say, okay, so if you have a non-arm's length transaction, here are some benchmarks that we can apply to think about what that arm's length price should have been. But the problem is that these rules tend to be fairly complicated and aren't very transparent. And so kind of the reform that I'm going to look at here is thinking about, okay, so rather than thinking about using these benchmark rules, why don't we just use delivered prices for coal, right? So, I mean, you could have a bunch of transactions within there, but at the end of the day, what the coal is worth is what the end consumer is willing to pay. The end consumer being a coal-fired power plant or a utility or an export market or whatever you want to think about. Okay? So that's the price they're willing to pay. That's the true price of the resource. And if you want to think about calculating royalty revenues, you should calculate royalty revenues based on that final price. And rather than these prices for affiliated sales, or prices using these complicated benchmarks that nobody really understands. And if you do that, then there's this idea that the whole process is going to be a lot clearer and a lot simpler, which would be an improvement. But okay, so then the thing is you want to look at delivered prices net transportation costs. Okay, because whether or not transportation costs should be included in royalty payments. That's an issue up for debate. I've got stuff that looks at this as well. So part of the paper is, if you do include transportation costs in terms of royalty evaluation, how that would change market outcomes as well. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. I'm just going to focus on delivered prices net of transportation costs. So, does everybody understand any questions about the reform or what's going on? I don't know. Okay. Well, let me know if it's not clear. All right. So what's going to happen when we reform? So the reform is thinking about using delivered prices to base royalty payments and royalty evaluation on, rather than using these reported prices, which are reported to Honor, which may include these affiliated sales. So the Honor came out and said that if we change this valuation and use delivered prices, it's not going to really have an effect on these markets. But if you just look at the markets, you see that there's probably going to be this large effect, because there's a really large difference between the price that's reported to Honor for royalty valuation and then the average prices that are reported by the end consumers, the coal-fired power plants and utilities that use coal in the U.S. So if you get to the data and you look at average annual prices, so dollars per short ton, from 2008 to 2014. So the average price in Montana reported to ONRR, or Honor, I guess, is $15.30 per short ton. But if you look at delivered prices to end consumers from coal from Montana, the average delivered price is $22 per short ton. So that's a 44% increase, which would have a huge effect. So for Wyoming, there's a pretty large difference as well. So I mean, a price difference of 20% is still a pretty large price difference.
Do these delivered prices, are those net of transportation costs?
Those are net of transportation costs. Because for Wyoming, when you add in transportation costs, it's like $30 for a short ton. Okay, so the research question is, what would have happened from 2008 to 2014 if coal royalty payments for federal leases were going to be based on delivered prices with the transportation costs? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So the focus is going to be on steam coal, so that's coal used for electricity production. That's 93% of the market, so that's going to be the lion's share of what's going on. We're not going to talk about exports. I'm not going to talk about met coal or coal used for coking. Just look at 2008 to 2014, because those are the years that I have data for. So the issue here is that if you change the way that we value royalties in these markets, and you're going to increase royalty payments to the federal government, then that's going to have this effect on prices and quantities. You can't assume that prices are going to stay the same and the quantities are going to stay the same, and just increase these royalty rates to think about how much revenue you're going to get. Because when you change how royalties are valued, that's going to have this price and quantity effect. That's also going to change tax revenues as well. So you have to control for all these changes simultaneously to think about what's going to happen. So in the study I'm going to show you, I'm controlling for these changes in prices and quantities. Because those changes in prices and quantities are going to have a feedback effect on what you expect for your revenue changes to be. But there are all these tax interactions too. Because when I want to think about severance tax payments, I get to deduct royalty tax payments from my severance tax payments. So what happens now is that if I end up paying more in royalty payments, then that means I get to deduct that from my severance tax payments, and there's these tax interactions. But I get to deduct both severance tax and royalty taxes for when I pay corporate income taxes. So you got to think about those tax interactions there as well. So I'm going to account for all of that. But you're not going to see it, but I promise it's in the model if you want to take a look at it. And then there's some usual data issues and limited information and all that other good stuff that you have with any study. So we're really limited by Honor by the data that I'm able to get. So they only have state level information on royalty collection. So I don't have anything at mine levels. So I'm going to really focus on state year analysis. And I'm doing that because that's the best I can do, because the government's not going to give me any better information, at least not yet. The other thing to worry about is there's heterogeneity in coal. What that means is that coal differs primarily due to the basin that it comes from, both in sulfur content and energy content. And so you want to worry about those differences, because that may lead to these different substitution effects going on. And you also have to worry about demand supply side substitution as well. So demand side substitution would be, I'm a coal-fired power plant. I'm getting my coal from a mine that's on federal land. We changed federal royalty policies, and now what's going to happen is it's cheaper to get coal from mines on state land or private land. And so you want to think about coal-fired power plants substituting away from mines on federal leases to state or private leases. For supply-side substitution, you want to think about coal mines that may be on both state and federal land. And they say, you know, forget this federal lease because it's too expensive now. We're going to stop mining there, and then we're going to go solely mine on state leases. So that's kind of the supply-side substitution to worry about too. And I'll talk about that later on. All right, so here are the results. So any economist worth their weight could tell you that when you change these royalty valuations, you're going to increase the price of coal, you're going to decrease the quantity of coal that's extracted, you're going to increase in royalty revenue, a decrease in severance taxes, and a decrease in corporate income tax. So we know the directions of all the changes. That's really easy. The hard part is figuring out about how much. And why this matters is because if you change the way that royalties are calculated, and you don't have a large increase in royalty revenue, but let's say you really have a large increase in price, then you might not want to do that, right? Because energy prices are going to go way up, and you're not going to have a real effect on what's going on in these markets. So you want to think about how the price and the quantity change are going to be in proportion to the revenue changes that you might expect. And so thinking about by how much is the really important part of this study. Okay? The results are also going to vary by state. And then I'll talk about states here in a minute. But for most time, I'm just going to focus on Montana and Wyoming. All right. But overall, for all the states, the 9 states that have federal coal mining leases that make royalty payments that we're going to look at here, prices actually are going to go up by less than 2% when you change the way that royalties are valued based on delivered prices. Quantities are going to decrease by actually less than 1%. And then your increase in royalty revenue is going to be anywhere between 106 to 176 million per year. And those are the 90% confidence intervals. So my best guess is that you'd have an increase in royalty revenue of 141 million per year. And that's going to be a 22% increase. So severance taxes and income taxes are going to decrease by a combined 4 million a year. That's going to be easily offset by the increase in royalty revenues. So what I'm going to find is that if you change the way that royalties are determined for leases on federal land for coal, you're going to have these large revenue effects, but the price of energy isn't really going to go up by that much, and you're not going to lose coal mining jobs. So you have these really small price and quantity effects, these large revenue implications. So that's what I'm going to find. So what I'm going to talk about first is just talk about the data that I use, show you some summary statistics from that data, and then I promise no equations, so I'm just going to go over the very basics of the model. But as a theoretical economist, that's the fun part. Then get into the more detailed results that we have here. Talk about some additional analysis, testing the validity of the results that we're going to find. So what are the things that you need to worry about? How is the information that we're going to find biased? And what direction does that bias go? And then talk about what's happening now and what we think we're going to do in the future. All right, so focused on the state year level, and that's primarily due to data limitations. And I'm only going to look at 7 years, so 2008 to 2014. I'm going to look at these 7 years because I want to use annual variation in what happens to estimate these confidence intervals that I'm going to show you. And so I can't give you a precise answer, but I can give you what I expect to happen and confidence intervals associated with what I think is going to happen as well. But that's going to be using that annual variation to do that way. So there are 9 states that are going to be included here because there are 9 states with production on federal land that make federal royalty payments to honor. The important thing, though, is that this excludes a lot of large coal-producing states. So it excludes West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana. And these are pretty large coal-producing states. But the reason it excludes them is because their coal mining operations occur primarily on state and private land. So they're not making federal royalty payments. And that's what I want to look at. Out of those 9 states, I'm really just going to focus on Montana and Wyoming. I do that for a couple of different reasons. Primarily because probably nobody here cares about Alabama. But also, I'm also cherry picking these states as well. You have the largest results in Wyoming and Montana. And Wyoming and Montana are in the Powder River Basin. And for reasons I'll explain later, I'm going to get the most accurate results for Wyoming and Montana. And so that's why I want to focus on those, because they have the largest impact. And I think, I'm pretty sure, positive that I'm estimating the results in these states more accurately than others. Okay, so again, focus on steam coal that's used domestically. That's 93% of the market. So thinking about what this ignores. So the important thing here is that these other types of coal, so coal used for coke or metallurgical uses or exports, have higher prices. Okay? So domestic steam coal is the type of coal that has the lowest price per short ton. When I get information from Honor about royalty collections, what that does is that includes all types of coal. So that includes these higher priced coals. And then when I have observed the deliveries, I'm just including lower priced coal. So that's obviously going to bias the results. But what it's going to do is it's going to bias the results in a way such that the $141 million more a year I said we're going to get is actually a lower bound. And what you would expect is that number to be biased downwards, so the real number is probably going to be higher than that. But that also means that the price and quantity effects, which were relatively small, are going to be biased downwards as well. But we still expect those to be in proportion to whatever revenue estimates that we're getting there. So the flavor of the results aren't going to change. So you're going to have this large revenue effect with a small effect on price and quantity. All right, 6 different types of data that's used here. So I've got royalty collections from Honor at the state year level. But the thing is that nobody tells you what mines are on federal leases. So the FOIA request where we got data to match mines with federal leases. So we've got that. And then from S&L Financial, I have mine level information for every month on production, so the quantity they extract, what the delivered prices are, the transportation costs associated with those deliveries, and then what kind of coal, so what sector, whether it's steam coal, met coal, exports, stuff like that. And then from state websites, you get severance tax rates and corporate income tax rates. So you can kind of use those stated rates to use those tax interactions there. The other 2 types of information that I use are elasticity. So I'm going to use the price elasticity demand. This I'm going to get from a study from the Energy Information Administration. So but it's pretty recent, it's from 2012. But the price elasticity demands I'm only going to get are going to be at the NERC region level. So NERC is the, there's like NERC and FERC, and I always get them messed up. But it's some energy regulatory thing or whatever. You can look it up online, I guess. But so I don't have elasticities at the state level. I only have elasticities at the NERC region level. But there's this other study here that, I mean, the conclusion of that is that if you use price elasticity demands at the NERC region level, that's a really good approximation of what's going on at the state level. So I'm going to rely on that to say that even though I just have information at the NERC region level, that's going to be okay. So I'm going to have annual measures of price elasticity demands at the NERC region level. So for WEC, which is like the Western Energy Collective Cooperative, I forget actually what it stands for. That's my bad right now. I'm going to know what the price elasticity demand is in that area, that NERC region, for every year from 2008 to 2012. And then what I do is I'm going to use that annual variation in that price elasticity demand to calculate the point estimate of what I think it is, but also standard error around that. And then, so what I have is I have coal deliveries from Montana mapped to all the states that they're delivered to. And so I'm going to map all those states into their NERC region. And then I'm going to get a share-weighted price elasticity demand for coal leaving from Montana. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. And then I'm going to use price elasticity supply, which is going to be thinking about, so price elasticity demand is how sensitive coal consumers are to changes in prices. So I want to think about how sensitive coal-fired power plants and utilities are to changes in prices. It's going to be kind of related to the slope of the demand curve and also where you are on the demand curve as well. So for price elasticity supply, I'm going to get estimates from the NIMS model, which is this big model that the Energy Information Administration has on the whole energy sector. So every year they publish this model and rerun updates, and I can extract the price elasticity supply from that. It turns out it's really hard to get information on the supply side of the coal industry, probably because nobody wants to tell you what's going on. As a firm, right, you don't want to release your data, tell you good information about your costs. So it's really hard to get. But I've got this point estimate for the elasticity and the standard error around that. But what I'm going to also do is think about, I think that these estimates of elasticities are going to be somewhat flawed, and then think about how sensitive the results are to those assumptions. And so there's a couple different ways I'm going to do that and how I'm going to evaluate the results with respect to those assumptions. So one, I'm going to have confidence intervals I can put around these measures. But the also thing in the model that I construct, I think about theoretical limits that are imposed by the changes that you can see, and use those to kind of bound the estimates as well. All right, some summary statistics. So for Montana and Wyoming, Montana the price is usually around $22 per ton, and then Wyoming is about $15 per ton. So transportation costs tend to be much higher in Montana and Wyoming because we ship our coal to a lot of other areas. So Wyoming's one of the few states where the average transportation cost is greater than the average cost of the coal per ton. And if you look at the quantity, so the quantities are in thousands of short tons. So Wyoming is by far the largest coal producer in the United States. They produce way more coal than anybody else. So Montana is still fairly large, but I mean, compared to Wyoming, we're blunt. The other thing is the share of coal extracted within that state is on federal land. Okay, so in Wyoming, almost all the coal is extracted on federal leases. And then in Montana, we have a really high share of coal that's extracted on federal leases. Okay, so now talking about the model. So what I want to do is I want to think about how to account for this change in valuation. So we're going to go from these prices that are reported to honor and start using delivered prices. Okay? So the thing to keep in mind is that the delivered prices are really like the price. And the reason that delivered prices are the price is because that's the price that everyone cares about. If you're a coal mine, that's the price you care about because that's what you're going to get paid for. If you're a utility, that's the price you care about because that's what you have to pay. So any notion of market equilibrium is going to be determined by delivered prices. And whatever prices are going to be reported to honor, whether they're lower or not, are just going to be what's reported to honor. And maybe there are some affiliate sales in there, maybe not. But any market equilibrium that you want to talk about is going to be constructed from delivered prices. All right, so the deal here is that royalty payments could be based on these lower reported prices. And then what does that do? Well, that lowers the amount of royalty payments that you're going to get. So if I want to think about moving from these reported prices to using delivered prices for royalty payments, I could do that by an equivalent increase in the royalty rate. So what's going to happen now is that if our royalty payments are lower because of these lower prices reported to honor, that's equivalent to having a lower effective royalty rate right now. And then what we could do is think about increasing that royalty rate to what it should be, or what we think that we're getting. So right now we think that we're getting 12.5% for coal that's surface mines. That's the federal royalty rate for surface mines. It's like 7-something% for underground mines. So in Wyoming, where almost all mines are surface mines, we think we're getting 12.5% of royalties being paid to us, right? But if they're using lower prices to base those royalty calculations, the effective rate is actually lower than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to determine what the current effective rate is, and then I'm going to use royalty collection to calculate what we think is the statutory rate, what the rate we think we're getting is, and then evaluate the change in that royalty rate from the current effective rate to the statutory rate. And that's how I'm going to account for this change in valuation. The reason I'm going to calculate the statutory rate from reported prices is because a lot of times, let's say we're going to get 12.5% from surface mines in the U.S. That's on federal land. Well, some of the problems are that some mines will get royalty rate reductions. So they'll apply to the BLM and they'll get royalty rate reductions. So if I assume that all mines are going to give us 12.5%, that's an incorrect assumption. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the observed collections to calculate the statutory rate. And those rates are actually going to include any royalty rate reductions that we have, right? So these are the rates that we think that we're getting. So if you notice in Wyoming, it's almost around 12.5%. That's because Wyoming doesn't grant very many royalty rate reductions, and most of the mines are all surface mines. So that's why that's close to 12.5%. Montana is fairly close to 12.5% as well. These other states have lower statutory rates, and that's either due to royalty rate reductions or this combination of both surface mines and underground mines where the royalty rate is lower. Okay? And then if we look at what we're getting now based on delivered prices, so this effective rate is going to be lower, right? And so you can think about the difference. And so like I said before, I'm going to cherry pick Wyoming and Montana here because the difference in the rates between the effective rate and statutory rate are a lot higher, right? The other thing to say is that, okay, so maybe in Oklahoma and Utah and New Mexico, we don't have any affiliate sales going on because the difference between the effective rate and statutory rate is nil, right? Well, the problem is that I have imperfect data. And so if you have met coal or coal exports in these states that are at higher prices, that's biasing this difference downwards. And so you could still have this difference in the rates in Utah and Oklahoma and New Mexico, but I just can't measure them. And for the other states, the difference that I do measure is probably going to be lower than what it actually is. All right, so I have this model. It's in the paper. I'm not going to show you any equations, but it's this nice theoretical model. From the theory, I kind of derive these expressions that I want to determine. And so things that I want to determine are, well, how's the price going to change when you increase the royalty rate from the effective rate to the statutory rate? How does the quantity change? How does that affect royalty revenues, severance taxes, income taxes, that kind of stuff? But the thing you got to worry about is you got to be able to construct a model that allows you to determine these things, but determine them as functions of data that you have, data that you can actually use to estimate. All right, so I've got this partial equilibrium model, and I'm not making really any assumptions about demand or supply using general forms. The thing I'm going to do with this model is I'm going to include the different tax policies and the tax interactions. So the interactions between royalty revenues, severance taxes, and income taxes. And then what I want to do is add in some features specific to the coal market. So kind of differentiate everything, move things around, and then get these expressions for the things that we want to talk about next. Okay? So it turns out that I can do this in a way that the expressions just depend on elasticities and those observed monthly variables that we have, and also the revenue collection. So then I can calculate these things, figure out what their standard errors are, and go from there. But the validity of the results depends on some of the modeling assumptions I'm going to make. So it depends on whether or not these coal markets have high fixed costs, which I would argue that they do. And then I'm going to talk about this thing, asset specificity, which I can't say 3 times fast. I actually had to practice that because I always stumble over it. So, but this is talked about in the research about what happens is that coal mines form long-term relationships with power plants. And power plants specialize to get their coal from a particular mine. And because of this relationship, that's why you see the prevalence of long-term contracts in these industries. But what that means is that coal mines and power plants are kind of locked into one another. And so that's going to limit the ability for coal mines to substitute from one region to the next, or from state to federal land or federal land to state lands, and for power plants to switch basins where they get their coal. All right, so I've got the model. What I'm going to use the model for is to predict some baseline revenues. And these are going to be annual revenues that you're going to get. And so focusing on Montana, Wyoming, so I'm going to think about the revenues that you're going to get from royalty payments in Montana and Wyoming per year in millions of dollars. So Wyoming's going to get around 560 million, Montana gets about 24 million, and then the total across the 9 states. So I've excluded 7 of them here. That's why if you add them, they don't add up. Okay, and then, so what I'm going to do is that when I calculate the royalty revenues, I'm basing this information on collections. Okay, so I have actual collections for this. For severance taxes and income taxes, all I have are stated rates, and those are terrible. So I don't believe these levels. And if I look at the data, I know that these levels are off. So the severance tax levels and income tax levels are going to be way off. Income taxes are really hard because what makes this hard is that if I'm a coal mine in Wyoming, maybe I'm owned by Peabody or Arch or whatever, but I've got coal mines all across the country, right? If I want to think about paying corporate income taxes, it's not necessarily a mine that pays corporate income taxes, but the corporation itself. And so what I want to think about in terms of income taxes are just corporate income taxes that the share of the mine would pay. And so these numbers, I don't have any way to test to see whether they're real in the data or not, because the data is going to be really hard to get. Severance taxes I do, and that's something I'm going to work on later on. So, but what I'm going to tell you now, though, is that the levels of severance taxes and income taxes are completely wrong. But if you look at the model, one of the implications of the model, one of the results, is that the percentage changes in severance taxes and income taxes that I'm going to find are spot on. Okay, and that's the result of the theory. So I'm going to show you what I expect the changes in the levels to be. I wouldn't believe those, but what I would believe would be the percentage changes. But the levels of royalty revenues and the percentage of changes in royalty revenues, I would believe. But then I want to work later on. I'll talk about how I can get those severance tax figures to be more precise. All right, so here are the results. Think about the price effect. So I'm going to think about the expected change in the price. I got a 90% confidence interval, so I think about the maximum expected change in price that you see, the minimum expected change in price, and then convert that to a percentage change. So in Montana, I think coal prices, if you base royalty payments on delivered prices rather than stated prices, prices of coal are going to go up by 42 cents per ton. That's going to be a 1.92%. But that 42 cents is going to be anywhere between 46 cents and 38 cents. For Wyoming, it's going to be a smaller change, so 30 cents per ton, and that's really going to be anywhere between 32 and 23%. And then, that's going to be like a 2% increase as well. Overall, on average for the nation, it's going to be about 23 cents per ton, which is going to be less than a percentage increase. So price effects are small. Quantity effects are small as well. So thinking about the expected change in the quantity due to changing the valuation, the percentage change, and then these 90% confidence intervals as well. So for Wyoming, what's going to happen is that there's going to be this 900,000 ton reduction in coal. That may seem big, but Wyoming's mining 400 million tons per year, right? So that's a very small percentage change. Okay? So, so one thing to keep in mind is the figure I showed you before was thousands of short tons. These are just short tons. So a couple orders of difference there. Overall, you can see the quantity effect. So the quantity effect for the 9 states is probably made up of Montana and Wyoming. The other states have very marginal effects. But overall for the U.S., it's going to be less than 1% decrease in the quantity. All right, thinking about revenue implications. So what's going to happen to royalty revenues, severance taxes, and corporate income taxes? So royalty revenues are going to go up overall by 141 million per year. And Wyoming is going to get 128 million more per year. But this goes to the federal government. Because these are federal royalty payments. Montana would get 11 million more per year. And remember, I can think about the changes in severance taxes and income taxes, but I don't want to believe those. I would believe these. And then the changes that you would see in severance taxes and corporate income taxes are going to be really small on a percentage basis. Percentage change in royalty revenues are going to be pretty substantial. So Montana is going to get 45% more royalty revenues, and Wyoming will get 22%. Overall, because the effects are going to be smaller in other states, that average is going to be lower. So another thing is that the model is flawed in the sense that I'm assuming that severance taxes are going to go down. So one of the things that may happen is that states may, after the federal government changes the way that they value coal royalties, states may change the way that they value coal royalties as well. And so if states make this change, then what may happen is that states are going to get more severance tax revenues. And they're going to get more royalty revenues for coal mined on state land. So even though the change in severance taxes is negative, if you account for changes in state policy, so if Montana follows along with government reform once that happens, or if it happens, then you could have this increase in severance tax revenues for the state. It could be fairly large. But I'm going to work on trying to estimate that. So some of the things that you want to worry about, there are 2 different types of substitutions that the model doesn't account for. So there's substitution that could occur within a state from federal mine to then moving to a state lease, right? So moving from extracting coal from federal land to state land. And then you would worry about also about substitution across coal basins, and that would be so if I'm a coal-fired power plant in Wisconsin, maybe instead of getting my coal from Wyoming, now I'm going to get my coal from Illinois. And so you'd want to worry about those substitution effects as well because of this policy change. And I can't capture these effects in the model, but I can say why these are going to be unlikely to occur. And they're going to especially be unlikely to occur for Powder River-based states of Montana and Wyoming. But for other states in the sample, I can't say that these substitution effects might be substantial. But those states have very small revenue implications as well. So I don't expect a whole lot of going on in those states. So the reason why I wouldn't expect substitution from federal land to state land within a state, especially for the Powder River Basin, is because most of the extraction in the Powder River Basin occurs on federal land. So if you have a lot of coal mining assets on federal land, and the majority of it all is happening on federal land, it's going to be hard to keep up that same production by moving it all on state land. So the extent which you can move from federal land to state land is going to be pretty limited. And also, if the states adopt the same rules that the federal government does, then you have no incentive to move from mining on federal land to state land, because the royalty policies and severance tax policies you're going to face are going to be the same. So you're going to have no incentive to do that. And so that would limit substitution to federal state land. Now, if states don't follow through and have different royalty rates from the federal government, then that could be a cause for concern. So a little fun fact that's completely unrelated. So historically, one of the weird things that happened in the mid-'80s was the federal government was worried about states charging really high severance tax rates. So it turns out in the mid-'80s, the federal government had like a 12.5% royalty rate, but the severance tax rates in Montana and Wyoming were like around 30%. And what the government was worried about is states like us using our unfair advantage, because we have this monopoly control of resources, of Powder River Basin coal, to extract more rent by using this. And so there's federal legislation that passed that actually forced states to keep severance tax rates in line with federal royalty rates. And so they kind of limited it a long time ago. So, but by and large, you would think that, I think there's support in Montana for following these federal rules. I don't know what's going to happen in Wyoming. All right, so the other type of substitution would be substitution across coal basins. So now I'm going to switch from buying Powder River Basin coal to buying coal from Appalachia or Illinois Basin. So the thing to keep in mind is there are differences in energy content and sulfur content in coal. So from the Powder River Basin, the reason that we like Powder River Basin coal is it's low sulfur. But the downside of that is it's low energy content as well. But if you go to the Illinois Basin, it has a much higher sulfur content, which you're going to have to pay for or install smokestack scrubbers for, but also has a higher energy content as well. So there's these differences that matter. And then previous work by Paul Joskow has shown that, in the coal industry, you have really high switching costs due to asset specificity. And we'll stumble over that. All right. What that means is that for a coal-fired power plant, there's usually only one railroad that delivers to them. Because they don't have 5 different railroads coming to the coal power plant, then you have very limited options of where you're going to source your coal. And a lot of times they'll build a railroad specifically that connects the coal-fired power plant to a mine for that. So if you change your mind and you want to get your coal from somewhere else, it's going to be really hard to do that. So the other thing you need to worry about too is boiler efficiency. So when you build your coal-fired power plant, you engineer your boiler to maximize the efficiency of the coal that you're getting. So if I'm burning Powder River Basin coal, my boiler is all set to get this low BTU per pound coal. And then if I start buying Illinois Basin coal, which is more expensive, and then I have my boiler set to use lower energy content, then I'm essentially wasting a lot of that resources of that coal because the energy content is way different. And so you would expect that to be less likely to happen. So you would expect for these reasons, so the high switching costs and asset specificity, that you would have limited substitution across coal basins. So a couple things to, this is all like speculative, right? So a couple things to back this up. Mapped coal deliveries to power plants. So I think about where the coal is coming from, what plant they're going to. We did this for 2014 by the basin of origin. So if you look at 65% of all coal-fired power plants across the country got 100% of their coal just from one basin. Now, if you're on the East Coast, maybe you're coal from the Appalachian Basin, right? And if you're kind of on the West Coast, maybe it's from Powder River. But 65% of all plants are just going to get their coal from one basin. And then the energy and sulfur content really varies across basins. Within basins, there's a little variation, but not much. And if you extend that to 80% of plants, you're going to find that they're going to get 80% of their deliveries just from one basin. So the ability to substitute cross basins is going to be pretty limited. The other thing we did is compared the average energy content of deliveries. So we looked at each power plant, looked at all the deliveries going to that power plant, and calculated the average energy content of coal. So how many BTUs per pound they had in there. And then looked at all the coal being delivered to a particular NERC region and calculated the average energy content within those deliveries to the NERC region. So what you find is that if you look at the plant average, there's much less variation at the plant average and way more variation at the regional average. And that means that these plants are specifically designed to get their coal from one place that has the same energy content and the same sulfur content. And there's going to be more variation at the region. So that's another way to address that as well. All right, so I'm almost done. So what would happen here? So if we valued royalties based on delivered prices rather than stated prices and thought about using these arm's length transactions, you'd have a small effect on production, small effect on prices, this large revenue benefit. So a couple things to keep in mind. This is a retrospective analysis. I'm only saying what would have happened. So we would have gotten 141 million per year for over 7 years. I can't tell you what's going to happen. And quite frankly, nobody can tell you what's going to happen because coal markets right now are extremely volatile. If anybody tries to tell you what's going to happen, I wouldn't believe them. And then, so what I would say this does is that it highlights the importance of reforming these markets. Because if you make this reform, what's likely to happen is you're going to have a much larger revenue effect than you would price and quantity. And so there's still value in implementing this reform, even if you don't get those numbers. But yet again, these numbers are downward biased. So from 2008 to 2014, it could have been much larger than 141 million per year, but also like a larger price and quantity effect too. So a couple caveats. I've only looked at electric power sector, but that's 93% of the market. I can't really capture substitution and then think about heterogeneity in coal, but it's at a state year level analysis, and I've kind of given you some evidence of why I expect that not to happen. And then my results on severance income taxes are going to be less accurate, but I think I can do a better job at estimating what severance tax revenue changes are going to be. All right, and it's going to be more accurate for Montana and Wyoming. All right, so a couple reasons why we would care about this for Montana and Wyoming. So the proposed reform is going to have a really small effect on energy prices and jobs, so less than 2% each. But then what happens is states, when the federal government collects coal royalties, they refund 50% of that back directly to the states. But then they charge you 1% administration fee. So states get 49% of all coal royalty revenues back in their coffers, right? So for Wyoming, that's 63 million a year. Or if you look at the 7-year sample, that would have been 440 million per year. For Montana, it's only going to be 5.5 million a year, or 40 million over the sample. And these figures are going to be biased downwards yet again. But they could overall be larger if states follow through with their reforms as well. And then, yeah. All right, so what's happening right now? So I wrote this paper, it's under review, and then Headwaters wrote this policy briefing from the results in this paper. And then the policy briefing's been talked a lot about in the press. So it got mentioned in the New York Times. Then, I mean, you know, the Casper paper, the Gillette paper, Billings paper, that kind of stuff. So kind of in Western publications. It was widely discussed at these BLM listening sessions that were held across the country to think about how the BLM should reform coal markets. And then there's some changes that are going on to current policy as well. So we've had discussions with both federal and state legislators, and then the Coal Royalty Fairness Act of 2015 has been introduced. So Wyden and Udall introduced this in the Senate, Cartwright introduced this in the House, but if you look at their websites, when they talk about this legislation, all of them mention the policy briefing that's created. So it's kind of, I don't know, I'm a theorist, right? And even when I use actual data, I do structural work and nobody reads it. So this for me is like interesting because people are not, I mean, they're still not reading my academic paper, which is fine, but they're at least kind of reading derivatives of my work, which is great because this never happens to me. And then the other day we were approached from the Domestic Policy Council at the White House to kind of do some follow-up analysis to think about some other things that are happening with these markets as well. So right now, the big thing we're doing is just trying to figure out, get some funding to do some future work. So the future work we want to do is, in the short term, I want to get severance tax collection to really estimate what those changes in severance taxes are going to be at the state level. And if I can, I really want to get what the extractions are on state land. So I only can think about royalty revenues on federal land. But if states follow through and then change their royalty policies as well, then I can think about what royalty revenues in state lands are going to be and how they're going to change. And so, I mean, I think that, given the framework that I have, I can do this pretty easily. But it's just a matter of getting time and actually getting that information to do that. So longer term, what's in the works is thinking about how fiscal policy, so severance tax rates, royalty rates, affects changes in oil, gas, and coal markets altogether. So there's this talk of maybe what we want to do is increase royalty rates on both coal and gas. But when you increase both these rates, you have to worry about interactions between these different markets and substitution across coal and gas and all these other complicated things. But the data's out there, you can do this. So you have more complex substitution patterns. But then the concern is, well, how do climate policy objectives then relate to fiscal policy? Could one use fiscal policy to backhandedly achieve climate objectives? And this is something you need to get right because, it may be problematic is that you increase these. So if I look at just what happened with coal royalties, if you increase the royalty rate or limit these non-arm's length transactions, you get a large revenue effect, but you get no change in quantity. So if I want to think about climate policy objectives, you'd want a large change in quantity. But then you're going to have this debate about coal mining jobs versus climate policy objectives. But what we need to know is thinking about how fiscal policy is going to be related to both the energy prices and then the quantities in these markets. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. That's all I have, unless you want to see references and stuff. So thank you again for coming. It's been fun talking about it.
Time for a few questions?
Sure.
How far in history does it go back that coal companies were selling coal to themselves to get the first price down?
So the thing is I can't really even observe coal companies selling coal to themselves. What I can observe, though, is I can observe reported prices to honor to base their coal valuation on, and I can observe delivered prices. And I know there's a large difference, and I have strong anecdotal evidence that there are these affiliate sales going on. But I'm not really interested in hammering down coal companies and saying, look what you're doing. I'm just really interested in eliminating these inefficient policies and kind of making markets work a little bit better. But yeah, I would suspect it goes back a ways.
I think it's like a 1990s.
So I'm a watershed hydrologist, and I was drawn to use of basehead as an organizational structure. Talking about this, is that based mostly just on the quality of the coal in the basin being tied to a particular facility to process a particular coal, or does it have something to do with the freight network, right, in terms of train network and how that tends to line up with river networks, things like that?
So it's quite predominantly tied to basin reserves. So you have these geological features across the United States that lead to coal reserves. And so the different basins have different coal deposits in them. And so then,
Depositional basin, or the original basin,
Not current watershed basin.
no.
I guess my first question should be what do you mean by basin? I should.
yeah,
Me?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, I was thinking, like, given the policy relevance of the work and how it's being picked up in the press and by the White House, shouldn't the longer-term goal to include the prices, the current kind of consumer price for coal, be shifted to a shorter-term goal in terms of how climate policies are going to be affecting the coal price? So I guess the question is like, how sensitive is this change in the royalties to the price of coal today and what it might be in the future with climate policy?
So I would like to tell you this result right now. This is a really hard problem. I can do it, but it's going to take a really long time. So, I mean, maybe a year away. So I would love to tell you what the results are right now. I realize it's really important. There's just no way I can get you the results right now.
Okay, but I mean,
So I can tell you this stuff here in a couple months before all the hearing and listening sessions are over, and then you're going to enact policy changes, right? And I think this stuff would be important to get right, because you want to have the good information when they think about making these proposed rule changes. But this is going to be more of a longer term, and I think it's really important, but it's a much harder problem.
but are your results, I mean, I know you're presenting like the kind of the minimum change, so you have a conservative estimate there, but I mean, are the results presenting like too optimistic a perspective on this reform, because it's ignoring any kind of climate policy influence on the pricing of coal?
Okay. Yeah, so the thing that I have here is if I start talking about climate policy with respect to this policy change, it opens up a whole other can of worms. So that's why I'm going to limit it and focus to saying, look, we have these non-arm's length transactions that are occurring. And what we want to do is we want to think about reforms that eliminate this gaming, and then think about a clear and easier way to base royalty evaluations off of and using delivered prices. And so this policy change is going to have a large effect. And then if we want to think about climate change after that, great. But like as a first step, rather than kind of bringing in a bunch of other stuff in the discussion, which is completely relevant and really important, just think about what you can do in the short term.
On the one hand, one might say that it's completely unrealistic to ignore any kind of policy related to climate change on the coal pricing. And so this analysis is to be considered quite misleading in the sense that it's encouraging states to pursue this reform through. And I mean climate policy is happening.
Agreed. But so if I want to think about this from a climate perspective, though, it's not going to get any worse, though, right? Because, well, I mean, it's going to get worse in terms of cumulative effects. But you're going to have this decrease in coal production, albeit very small, but you're not going to get this substantial increase in coal production by implementing these reforms.
But I think so you're saying that if the prices go down, then the potential revenue benefit is minimal, right? And that even climate policy will continue to push prices down. But just think about the predicted royalty savings or royalty increases in these 5 years. So in 2007, we moved back to New Zealand because we thought there would be climate policy passed. So even in a federal time window of making climate policy of 5 years, that's hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And the argument that Headwaters is making right now in the DC policy space is just to say, look, even if it's only for 2 years, is a set of revenues that this is all flying in a policy space which is about a general public interest in accountability from large corporations. It's actually relatively outside of climate policy conversations. That's what makes this policy opportunity, right? And then I think is that across Congress there's less of a tolerance of loopholes and things like that. So even in a few years, if you can collect that much more revenue, then you can start to think about directing it towards the energy transition. But it's actually operating in a totally separate policy.
It's a framing issue, right?
Yeah, I see that, but it seems to be building momentum towards. It seems to be building momentum in the wrong direction if we're trying to address climate change.
So, I mean, there's two different paths, right? But I think they're kind of going in the same direction. One thing I would say is that, so let's say coal prices plummet, which they have. So what's going to happen with these numbers? Well, the flavor of the results is still going to be there. So if you have this change in royalty valuation that we're talking about here, you're probably going to get these revenue effects, which are much larger than the price and quantity effects. And so you should have no reservations then about implementing these policies.
All right, it's 1 o'clock, and I know a lot of people have other things they have to get to, but thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you.